It was a very traumatic time. And since I was so young, I think that I experienced it so much through my body, so much through just fear, terror. At one point, as an adult, I was told by a knowledgeable therapist that I likely left my body from the shock of having my primary caregiver disappear from my life. So what I remember is I woke up one day and my mother wasn't there anymore. And I remember being in the car in the back seat and with my sister who is a year and a half older than me, and our father saying, "You'll see your mother on Sundays."
Hi, my name's Lawrence Joss, and welcome to the Family Disappeared podcast. And today we have Dana on the show. And Dana is a previously alienated child, and now she's an adult. And she has a phenomenal, powerful story to tell and has a lot of insights from the perspective of a very young child starting at 4 years old, and what that looked like for her, how it was to navigate her family system, and what reconnecting with her mom later on in life looked like and the challenges that came up with that. And she also shares some regrets and some things she wished she would have done differently, and how the situation could have gone differently. And incredibly important and poignant conversation. And if you're in the middle of this, whether you're a parent or a child, young adult, there is some really wonderful nuggets to glean from this. And if you're new to the community, welcome. Thanks for coming out to listen to the show. All Dana's information is going to be in the show notes, a link to her memoir, to her newsletter, her website, and a great place to go and ask some questions. And she's open to engage in the community. And if you have any questions for me, familydisappeared@gmail.com. All that information is in the show notes. And also the free 12-step support group that we have, Parental Alienation Anonymous. There's a link to that in the show notes. And as we're talking and interviewing with Dana today, she talks about the need for community and resources and being more resourced as she went into these places of reconnecting with her mom. So with that, let's jump into the show. As a parent and someone going through this process and not having the terminology of parental alienation and not really understanding the intricacies of what was happening early on in my journey, in my interactions with my kids, I would just want them to love me. I would just want them to say, "Hey, I love you, Dad. Like, this is great," and that stuff, and really get to the healing. And I had no idea of the complexity of what was happening in their bodies and minds. And they don't have that idea either, because developmentally they're so young. But the need for them to kind of like shut down, and as Dana brings up in the show later on today, is about repressing their feelings and pushing down all their love and all the, most probably a lot of the positive memories that they had with me in order to survive. And then I think as time goes on, they have a harder time, as Dana shares also for her, of accessing those emotions. And sometimes I like look at my kids and I'm like, can't you just see me? Like, I'm a good dad. I'm a good person. Just love me. Just acknowledge it. And I kind of like negate their experience and all that stuff that they've had to navigate and push down and push aside and swim through in order just to survive. Like, how can I think that they could access the joy and the play and everything like immediately? There's so much pain and healing, and there's so many resources that I've garnished and so many tools that I have. And I love that Dana talks about, like, cultivating those tools for ourselves, no matter where we are on the journey or which side of the journey that we're on. And I have so much more compassion and empathy for anyone going through this, that's a young adult, a child, or anything like that. And yeah, even me, I knowed more, or even today, even in my interactions today, I can see where there's more space for grace and understanding, and taking a breath when I'm talking to my children, and really taking in what they've gone through and what that journey looked like, pushing part of themselves away and then trying to find their way back to those parts, which they might and what they might not. And it might not be their journey to reconnect with me either. I'm not really sure, but What a great interview. I'm so grateful that Dana's jumped in to have this conversation with that. And with that, let's get into what Dana has to say. Dana, it is so great to have you on the show today. Thank you for coming out to spend a little bit of time with us. And if you could just introduce yourself to the community, just let them know who you are and how you're connected to parental alienation, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I'm happy to be here. My name is Dana Laquidera, and I am an adult alienated child. I was alienated from my mother when I was 4 years old after my parents' volatile divorce. And I, spent the better part of a lifetime really searching for the truth of what really happened, validating my own intuition of what I thought had happened, and then healing from being alienated and eventually speaking out about it and writing about the topic as well.
Oh, thank you for that, Dana. And I really, again, appreciate you being here to talk on the subject because there's so many people in the community that really can benefit from perspective from a child, what it's going through, and also the young adults and children and older adults that are alienated or have been alienated. It's wonderful to have them represented on the show too. So with that being said, you said at about 4 years old, this alienating process started for you, and at that age you remember what kind of sense you had that your mom was disappearing, or what did that look like in the beginning? Like, what memories do you have of that?
It was a very traumatic time. And since I was so young, I think that I experienced it so much through my body, so much through just fear, terror. At one point, as an adult, I was told by a knowledgeable therapist that I likely left my body from the shock of having my primary caregiver disappear from my life. So what I remember is I woke up one day and my mother wasn't there anymore. And I remember being in the car in the back seat and with my sister who is a year and a half older than me, and our father saying, "You'll see your mother on Sundays." And I just remember this feeling of just powerlessness and afraid to ask questions. I just knew something really bad was happening. And then I do remember some of the visits with my mother. So we stayed in the home with our father. We lived above our paternal grandparents. So, this was my father's home, really, more than my mother's. And the visits with my mother required her to borrow a car to come get us and bring us to her now rented apartment, where she was really in survival mode. So that's what I remember about that time. It was just scary, and I didn't say a lot, didn't ask questions, and just sort of went into this numb survival mode.
Well, what an intense experience for a child to have. And was this like gradual where it went from seeing your mom maybe half the time where she was living in the house to just seeing her on Sundays? Did it gradually happen, or was it just like one day, this is what the new rules are and that's how it's going to be?
My memory of it is it was one day we were told, "This is when you'll see your mother on Sundays." So it went from "she's gone, she's exiled" to "you will see her on Sundays." And then that went on for several months, but it ended by the time my father remarried, which was within a year of the separation.
So once your dad remarried and then your mom just didn't have any access whatsoever and kind of like completely disappeared from the picture?
I do recall, and this scene is actually in my memoir. I recall my mother showing up to our home for my birthday. I believe it was my fifth birthday. And I had a stepmother by then who we were calling mom. And I recall my mother coming in and my father pacing, and he was very agitated that she was there. And I knew this. My stepmother started crying, went downstairs to be with my paternal grandmother. And I recall as my mother she gave me the birthday gift, and I said nothing. It felt scary because I knew she wasn't, according to my father, supposed to be there. She wasn't welcome. I, by that point, associated her with my father's anger. And I saw him speak to my sister. And then before my mother left, my sister said to our mother, "We don't need you here anymore. We have a new mommy," which, of course, we all know were not her words or her true feelings. But that is how quickly she, was weaponized, really.
Wow, that is a powerful memory. Seeing your dad talk to your sister for a couple seconds, and then that come out of her mouth at about 7 years of age, and as you're saying, weaponized and being a surrogate for your dad's feelings and emotions, and it's also interesting how you associate the anger that your dad was feeling with your mother, and that just got you to shut down even more, is what I heard. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think that's a very common thing for alienated children. The thoughts of their alienated parent bring up feelings of anxiety, fear. In the case of, like, my sister, it was anger. For me, it was anxiety. It gives us this dark, scary feeling, and I can't overemphasize how terrifying it can feel, even though logically it makes no sense. This was a parent we always loved and who loved us, but now we're terrified in their presence or at the mention of their name. And it is just, that is the programming. That is the programming. The parent who wants that targeted parent out of our lives, whether consciously or not, they instill this fear in the child.
So, just thinking back a little bit, like this idea of this anxiety that came up for you and the fear that came up for your sister, anytime your mom's name would come up or she'd be mentioned or there'd be some thing in the house referencing her, I'm presuming each time that came up, your dad would got really big, really angry, and your anxiety escalated. And then the association happened with your mother any single time she was around that is associated with what had been slowly, slowly programmed into you in the house.
Yes, I recall that feeling coming up when discussing our mother with my sister. I don't actually have more than one childhood memory of her name coming up with my father. We learned pretty quickly, don't ask for her, don't talk about her. And so my sister and I would whisper about her in our bedroom at night. Every now and then we'd be sharing memories. And I titled my memoir, You Know Who, because we would call her You Know Who. We were too afraid to mention her name, to call her mom, or even, her first name. And so she became You Know Who, and we would share our memories.
Wow. Wow. And just to reference what Dana's talking about, which is her book, You Know Who, An Alienated Daughter's Memoir. That'll be in the show notes. There'll be a link there. There'll be a link to Dana and her newsletter, which is free, and some other offerings that she has. So the different stuff we're discussing will definitely be in the show notes for you all to reference. And when you actually explain the title, Dana, in that way, that you knew who was like how you and your sister communicated around your mom, like I viscerally feel that in my body. I feel like some heat in my chest and like a contraction. And my gosh, what a crazy way to have to live just to be able to have any kind of memory of your mother.
Yes. Yeah, it really highlights the severity of this coercive control, this type of psychological abuse. And, I feel so sad for my mother that we could not even speak her name. And then also, of course, for us as children, it's just so unnatural and so obviously coerced.
Yeah, no, no, that is definitely heartbreaking. And you mentioned this idea of kind of like cutting off from part of yourself or splitting off from yourself in order to survive. Can you talk about that a little bit of how that felt when you were really young and maybe in your teenage years, just a sense of kind of like losing yourself? Did you have a loss of identity or identity confusion?
Yes, I think, to lose your parent, your loving parent as a child is so traumatic that, and then if you don't have any support for grieving them, such as I imagine, if a parent has died, which would be very traumatic as well, there typically would be a grieving process and support for that process. But in the cases of alienation, we as the children are just having to repress our love for that parent, because it's way too painful to feel the love and feel the grief and have nowhere to put it, no one to go to express it. And so, I think that's why often, perhaps especially with a young child, but I think a child of any age will repress that love. And so then we don't have the access to the feelings of love for that parent. So that enabled my sister to tell her, go away, we don't want you, because in that moment she probably was feeling that anger and that, I'm okay without you, because she had repressed her love for our mother. As a teenager, I wasn't thinking about my mother. I had a void I was trying to fill, and I thought, well, I would seek fulfilling that void through romantic relationships, through dating, and and it was so unconscious, because it's not as if I thought, well, what I really need is my mother. So instead, I was just seeking, 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 thinking, I will be happy. I will fill this void if I, am loved by someone else, a boy, a young man that will help fulfill me, fill this void. And I did not stop and think, maybe I need to reach out to my mother. So I didn't actually see her again after the alienation until I was 15, and that was just a single visit with my sister.
Thank you for that. And you said a couple really interesting things that I just want to touch on a little bit. This idea of repressing your feelings and not having an outlet or being able to talk about anything, and by repressing the feelings and not really having access to have any kind of feelings, because the whole body of feeling spectrum is completely shut down. I think that's so incredibly poignant when you describe that that way, because so many parents and grandparents see this happening and feel like their kids hate them, don't like them, don't have the capacity to feel anything. But when you actually describe from your perspective and your lived experience that you had to keep pushing this down in order to survive, and then you couldn't access anything, so it was more of like a more of like a numb, neutral state than any kind of emotional state. Correct?
Correct. That's accurate.
Wow. That is super powerful visual, just to see that repression and that pushing down, and just the amount of energy and strength and life force that it takes just to push that stuff down. And God, how tiring that is to the nervous system, you know?
Yeah, right. Right. So much of my adulthood, or in my adulthood, having learned this, I did things to, to heal, like yoga and, being back in my body and allowing the feelings, and, in addition to some therapy and learning about this type of abuse and all that, I felt it was very important to, ground myself and really just be in my body again completely.
Yeah, that sounds like some incredible healing work. And I'm going to ask you a couple more questions about the younger stuff, and then we'll get into the healing stuff, because people need to know what the journey's like, and how to kind of like recover themselves. You had mentioned a couple of other things that I just want to ask some clarifying questions on. And one was this idea that you're in your paternal house, your paternal grandparents' house, living upstairs, and you have a stepmom. The paternal grandparents and the stepmom, what role, if any, did they play in this process of alienation? How did they keep the system going?
Well, nobody questioned my father. And, part of it, I'm sure we have to keep in mind, this was back in 1970, and he had grown up in a very patriarchal home, and his father was abusive. His father was abusive to his mother. So he had two sisters, and his parents, or at least his mother, and sisters, maybe unknowingly, I'm not sure that they knew what was really happening, because he only gave, he controlled the narrative and gave them the information he wanted them to have. And my mother had, in an attempt to escape the marriage, had an affair. So that was helped him to say, oh, look, she doesn't want her children. She would rather run off with this, another man, and she's destroying our home life. That narrative, leaving out the part that she was abused throughout the marriage. And so people, his family members sort of did what he asked of them and didn't question it. And these were people, my paternal grandmother loved my sister and me. So, part of it was the culture she lived in, and part of it was she believed what my father was telling her. So I don't hold her, I don't have any resentment toward her, but he was able to have things turn out the way he wanted, in part because nobody stopped him.
Right, and to just want to touch on this one point of this idea of the alienator controlling the narrative, which I see so often. They are kind of like the center point, and everyone comes through them. So any information that comes to them gets disseminated through their lenses and then passed on to different people within the family system. And it sounds like that's how your dad kept control over everything, because he was the central person that was giving out information.
Yes, yes, exactly. And it's like a virus that spreads. And my sister and me, as children, we had no access to other information. We lost access to our maternal family. Letters and cards that came to us, we didn't even receive. So, and it was the time before cell phones. So, but even if there were cell phones, we were too young to have them. So we had no access whatsoever to anyone outside of my father's life.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like a common thread on how people continue to control the environment, and the environments don't get really seen for what they are. And you had also mentioned that this idea of seeking, like seeking something external of you to kind of fill that void internally. And you mentioned, like boys and dating and looking for something because you couldn't really find yourself. So I heard you mention like boys. Were there other ways that you were looking for this thing that you couldn't find besides boys? Were there other things going on in your life that weren't necessarily the healthiest decisions, but the best decisions you could make at that time?
Boys were really my drug of choice. I think part of our coping mechanisms can be partly genetic. I think that's how my mother was coping with an abusive marriage. She wasn't drinking, she wasn't taking drugs. She, looked outside the marriage thinking, oh, maybe this other man can help me escape. And so perhaps I had some of those genes. And in my teen years, I wasn't that interested in drinking or drugs. And also, my father ran a tight ship. So I was afraid to do things that would get me in trouble. He was very authoritarian. And so that was just how I tried to fill the void. I had love to give, but also wanted to receive love. And I did not feel love, unconditionally loved in my home whatsoever. I didn't feel seen or known, or like my feelings truly mattered. And so I was just seeking that love and I guess validation, or sense of worth. And, you know, of, of course, looking back now, I know that was not a good way to find it. But that's what a teenager will do, who's seeking to fill a void.
100%. Yeah, yeah, and again, like your drug of choice, as you said, was boys. And a lot of kids in the situation. There's drugs, there's alcohol, there's food, there's all kinds of different things that come up. And yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And then you said at 15 you reunited or saw your mom just one time. How did that happen, and what was that like?
Yeah, so ironically, it was my sister who had the idea to go look up our maternal family. And so we started with looking up our grandmother. That was a little less scary than looking up our mother and our aunts. We had young aunts who they were several years younger than our mother, and we were very close to them as well. So we started by we secretly met up with our grandmother and aunts, and my sister used that opportunity sort of to interrogate them. Why didn't she come find us? And why did she have that affair? And she very much still saw our mother as the villain. and our father as the hero of the story. And I just knew deep down there's another storyline, and this really isn't accurate. And, I loved our mother. I was never afraid of her. It was my father who I was very intimidated by, but I was silent. I was just silent and let my sister ask her questions until it was time to leave. And of course, our grandmother was so happy to see us. And afterwards, I just thought how sad, though, that was the reunion. But I was following along with my sister's lead. And then shortly afterwards, we found our mother. She knew from hearing from our grandmother that we'd be reaching out to her, and we went and visited her. And she actually was living in our maternal grandparents' old home. So it was a house we had been in, many, many times as little kids. And again, I let my sister ask the questions. Our mother was so gentle in her answers and the way she handled my sister, that my sister sort of calmed down a bit um, in her anger, I guess you could say. But once again, I was just letting my sister take the lead. I sat there mute. It almost felt unreal, almost felt dreamlike that I was in this room with my mother. That I really still could not access feelings of love or grief. And I just sort of tucked that memory away. But I knew living in my father's home that I wouldn't dare reach out to her again while I was living at home. So, looking back, I think, oh, I wish I had sent her letters after that and kept the communication going. And she was very careful to not put us in a hard position. So she wasn't sending us letters and certainly wouldn't call our home phone to talk with us. Then, I think she was still afraid of my father and also just afraid of making things more difficult for us.
Wow. What an intense experience to have at such a young age, at around 15. And you mentioned a couple of things about your grandmother and your mom, and you said your grandmother was incredibly happy and excited to see you, and you said your mom was incredibly gentle. So it sounded like the landing, even though it wasn't optimum, was open and led with their heart, like their heart showed up there, right?
Yes, yes. She said she had always hoped that we would come find her and that she loved us. And, she cried. She had two little sons at the time. So we had two little brothers that we didn't know. And she was very careful about what she said about our father. And I think that was probably wise of her, especially given my sister's feelings about our father and wanting to protect him and thinking he did the right thing. She didn't want to, I guess, ignite, or I don't know, she wanted to keep it diffused, I think, with my sister. So she never really said any bad things about our father. She just really tried to convey that it wasn't because she didn't love us that she wasn't in our lives.
And this was 15 years old when you saw your mom like this. At what age do you remember actually thinking, "Wow, she was really gentle, she was really loving"? Like, when were you actually able to process and feel those emotions that you experienced at 15 years old?
I think I started thinking about it again when I was about 18. I started wanting to find more information and look deeper into the story. And it's like I knew all along that my mother didn't simply choose to abandon us. It made no sense to me. My father's narrative made really very little sense to me because I just knew she did love us. But it took me until age 26 before I reached out to her again. I was pregnant with my daughter, and I reached out and really gave her a chance to tell me her full story. I wanted to hear it.
Okay, just reflecting back on this for anyone that's listening to the show, like 15 years old, you had this conversation. It took you until about 18 to start like feeling some of the stuff and getting curious, and then another 8 years until you're 26 to actually make the call. And this seems like an incredibly long period of time but developmentally, it's where you had to go through in order to get to this 26-year-old and be pregnant and be ready to actually start accessing your feelings and being curious and present, right?
Yes, I think that's accurate. And I wonder if perhaps when I was 18 or when I went off to college, if my mother had communicated with me then, sent letters, it would have felt a bit safer because I was not at home anymore. I lived at school, at least during the school year for those 4 years. And I was caught up in all the things young college students are caught up in, classes and friends, and I was dating my now husband at the time. And so I wasn't thinking of her very much during those years after the initial seeking information at 18 years old. Then I sort of put it on the back burner again, unfortunately, for those 4 years. But if she had reached out to me, if I received a letter or something frequently or consistently, I think that may have helped me to act sooner. I can't say for sure, but I guess I part of me wishes that she had, because I wasn't the completely brainwashed child. I was more like the hostage child that, I knew my father's narrative wasn't accurate, but I was too afraid or disconnected from those feelings to act on them. But perhaps some reaching out on my mother's part may have pushed me along a little bit quicker.
Yeah, I hear that curiosity and maybe a longing for that to have happened, and you would have liked to experience that, and also that you were really busy with just growing up and figuring out your life and getting to class and just again trying to live. And developmentally, that makes so sense. There's not a lot of time in those years for kids to figure out their life, go to college, buy a book, have a boyfriend, and heal this major, major, major wound. So my curiosity is until 26, until you get to this point where you reach out to your mom, what kind of other interpersonal or healing work or embodiment stuff, what was in that period of time that maybe also helps you prepare to be able to reach out to your parents?
I was very interested in psychology. I studied education, but I took several psychology classes in college. I looked for books on personal development. I remember reading a book called Willpower is Not Enough, and some other books at that time. And I would do some self reflecting. I was just, I guess, interested in the world of healing and becoming, our better selves. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that I had that interest. And even though it took me a lot longer than I wish it had to really accelerate the healing, I feel like I was maybe had the temperament and the interest to go down that path.
And did yoga or any kind of embodiment practice start at that same time, or did that happen later on?
That started when I was about maybe late 20s, so a little bit after I first reached out to my mother to have a real conversation with her. And I've been doing it ever since, yoga and meditation. And so again, I'm grateful for those interests. I think they've been very helpful.
Yeah, just your curiosity and wanting to understand how the world works, and then the ability to get back into your body and start to ground and find yourself sounds incredibly loving, kind, healing, and created space for you for this next chapter of your life. So you're 26, you're pregnant. What's that moment that you decide, hey, it's time to reach out to mom? What happened? Did it just you wake up one morning? Like what did that look like? Wow, that was a powerful, powerful first half of the show. Dana just touched on some points that I don't really think of as an alienated parent, and I'm so appreciative of her. And I mentioned this in the introduction, and this was from Dana's interview, that this idea of repressing the feelings and pushing them down, and then losing access to the feelings or the emotions or to associate with a parent that the kids have loved so much. I thought that was most probably the most poignant moment from the first part of the episode. And just a reminder, come back next week for the second part of the show, and all Dana's information is in the show notes. Check out her memoir. Get in touch with her. Jump on her website. Jump into those resources. This is a really wonderful opportunity to connect with someone that has a lived experience and is continuing to live their life to the richest and the fullest extent. And with that being said, love to hear from you. Please like, share, let people know about the show. We're also a 501c3 nonprofit, and we need you to help support us. And everything we do is free. All our resources are free. Our 12-step program that is available to parents, grandparents, and children and young adults. There's specific meetings for children, I mean, not children now, but previous children, young adults, and adults where they can get support, where there are no parents or grandparents in the meeting. It's just for you. So if you're looking for community, if you're craving that, that's there too. And then there's mixed meetings as well, and it's all free. And we'd love you to contribute to help us continue to bring this to the whole community. And yeah, yeah. I feel some tingling in my body, some heat in my chest. And I share this because this is an intense conversation. There's a lot going on, and then the mind starts to spin and think about how we can do stuff in different kinds of ways. So that's alive for me too. In case no one's told you yet today, I love you. I love that we get to have these conversations in community. I love that Dana is now part of our community. And yeah, what a rich conversation. And we will see you around the neighborhood soon, I hope. Take care.